Hello, all. This is my fifth or sixth or seventh attempt at trying to do this because technology issues. So hopefully this goes smoothly. Anyway, my ethical dilemma is that there are two early childhood programs operating under one school or operating in one school building. We have Zines Early Childhood School, which is ZEX, and the Education Service Center, which is ESC. Both provide early childhood programs, but ESC provides educational services geared towards children with disabilities, children who are on documented IEPs. The ZEX program provides early childhood education for typically developing children and children with mild developmental delays. These delays can include things like trouble articulating words, or they use minimal vocabulary, have slowly developing social skills. So, ESC was contracted to provide these services for children with documented disabilities. And for over 40 years, Summersville School District has had these two programs operating under one roof. However, 2 years ago, a new director was hired who has substantial experience in both early childhood and as an emotional behavioral specialist. So, the new director of the educational services at ZEX, Miss Smith, has noticed that there is a deep fracture between the staff of ZEX and ESC, that there's minimal collaboration, and that there's really a disconnect between the two programs. So Miss Smith is the lead decision maker at ZEX, and there is a separate director for the ESC program. But because of this discrepancy between the programs, Ms. Smith wanted to reach out to a third party to evaluate the programs and figure out if there was a way to connect the programs and start operating as one unit. So 3 college professors, Dr. Green, Dr. Rowling, and Dr. Williams, who have had previous experience integrating early childhood intervention and inclusion into preschool, agreed to do this evaluation. In order to do that, they did a focus group, they did a survey, which included all stakeholders. They included administrators, teachers from both programs, and parents of students in both programs. What they ended up finding out is that the actual allocation of resources was vastly different between the two programs. The ZEX program was provided with many sensory spaces, craft supplies, decorations, books, things like that, while the ESC classrooms were a lot more minimal and didn't have an equal distribution of these supplies. It is important to note that ZEX enrolls much more children than ESC does. However, if you compare them side by side at equal numbers, ZEX is still receiving a lot more resources than ESC program is. So after the focus groups, the professors concluded that there was a clear district-wide bias benefiting the ZEX program. Administrators, teachers, parents all viewed the ESC program as secondary, and leading the allocation of funds is Mr. Thomas, who was the district's financial director. And he was stated by parents of children in the ESC program to have a clear preference for ZEX. Mr. Thomas works in the district's administration office, and his supervisor is the district superintendent. So Ms. Smith has the authority to bring in evaluators and hire and fire employees from ZEX, but she does not have authority over Mr. Thomas. After this evaluation was done and it was brought to light that Mr. Thomas is favoring ZEX, Ms. Smith then had an ethical dilemma as to what she was going to do with this information. So she was wrestling between whether she should report it directly to the superintendent or if she should put that information out there for the parents and teachers in both units. So essentially, we've got a couple different ethical dilemmas here. First of all, resources are not being equitably or equally divided for the people who need it, and this brings in the idea of liberal egalitarianism. So the students who most need these resources are the ones in the ESC program. They were born with a disability, and they should not be held responsible or be at a disadvantage because they were born the way that they are. And as ethical leaders, we have the responsibility to mitigate the damages that are done. There's also both the spectrum of justice and care within this ethical dilemma. And additionally, the ethic of critique is super, super important here, because had Miss Smith not gone out of her way to bring in outside evaluators, this could have gone on far longer than it did. She really served us as a reminder that as ethical leaders, we have an obligation to make sure that we are being responsible with our programs and evaluating for fairness and equality. Overall, what ended up happening is Miss Smith made the decision to give the information directly to the superintendent so that he could do what he thought was fit. And what the superintendent ended up deciding was to put Mr. Thomas on a 3-year probationary period, in which time he had to further explain his decisions for resource allocation and get it approved by the superintendent directly. He also had to get it approved by both program directors at ZEX and ESC. The reason why the superintendent didn't want to fire him right off the bat is because Mr. Thomas had spent a lot of years in the community. He had a good name out in the community, a good name with the ZEX parents. He spent a lot of time volunteering with the school districts and really was an integral part of the school district as a whole. So the superintendent didn't feel that it was right to terminate him right on the spot. He wanted to give him the opportunity to be better. And then furthermore, the superintendent realized he had the obligation and the responsibility to have caught this well before Miss Smith caught it. So he is saving himself a little bit, but he was also trying to save the school district because he wanted to see if this could be solved in-house before it was made aware to the public, where there would be obvious scrutiny. There would be a potential for parents not to want to send their students to the school district. So with all that being said, at the end of the day, Mr. Thomas was put on probation. Miss Smith did report it to the superintendent, and they are moving forward trying to mitigate damage and trying to keep the school district from losing any resources that they may by having lower enrollment numbers. So there we have it. Thank you, guys.